Cincinnati, yet another modern appearing American city, located in the Midwest in the state of Ohio, although some people in the Midwest would argue if Cincinnati is actually in the Midwest, as Ohio may be considered to be the East. Well, there was one point in time in our supposed United States history where Ohio was really the West, as was Kentucky. Fascinating how things change. Is this the real sequence of events, or is this simply what we're told? Cincinnati appears like a modern city, and yet, when we look deeper into it, we see that much like Chicago, a lot of the old world architecture survives, and it's intact, being in use well over 150 years in many cases. Cincinnati also has a very unique story to it, even for the conflicted stories that we often get for cities. We see how it began, or at least an earlier picture in 1840, and we're surprised at what we see with the incredible development. What's really the origin behind Cincinnati? And why does this city have such a conflicted and yet colorful story that we're given as part of its historical narrative? Cincinnati also has a personal story for me, and I'll include that at the end of this presentation. We see how Cincinnati appeared in 1812, and interestingly enough, we already see incredible development, although granted these are just sketches and these could have been done at any time by any person. But this rendering, the sketch, is supposedly what Cincinnati looked like in 1812. And here from later in its time frame, around the 1860s, although again this colored picture could be from any time frame by any artist. Still, it shows us a very well-developed city at a time when it should not be so well developed. And now we move forward to 1900, and keep in mind we have the standard story about how Cincinnati started. 3 random gentlemen in 1788 settled on the bank of the Ohio and the Licking River, and Cincinnati was constructed north of the confluence of these rivers. And yet, 100 short years later, we see this incredible infrastructure built out, much in the same way we did in Chicago. Now, it may be a little more explicable in Cincinnati because they had a little bit more time than Chicago, but not much. Are we to again accept the explanation that there were all these traveling workers going all over the country, that the ability to rapidly build this incredible infrastructure was due to having these traveling workers and no regulations in place? No safety standards, and you can establish an incredible city and you barely need 100 years to do it. And keep in mind, we're told that there was not advanced infrastructure, and yet looking at this rendering of Cincinnati in 1900, we see what is quite apparently a very modern city. And we have to wonder, why is it always these stories of 3 random people who settle it, and then it just goes through the natural phase of development and it seems very easy? Why? And now we look at the Roebling Suspension Bridge, completed in 1866, right after the United States Civil War. This picture was taken in 1870. Yet this bridge looks like it's been around much longer than 4 short years. Could there really have been this kind of wear and tear and erosion in 4 short years? It's a very strange sight, and again it defies explanation. There's no doubt about it that the bridge supports look much older than 4 years, and we look in the background and we see a city that's very built out. 1865. And a bridge that looks like it's been there for much longer than 4 years. And what's the explanation behind this? Well, they quickly built the bridge and they were cutting so many corners, and this is what we're left with. It already looks like it's old. Hard to see what's on the horizon, but again, we have signs of a city that's very built out in 1870. Not even 100 years after the city started by 3 settlers. Here's a later picture of the same bridge from the early 20th century. It looks a little newer. It looks like it's been cleaned up. But we have to wonder, are the dates on these photos truly accurate? And even so, the bridge is still not even 40 years old at the time of this photo. Yet it still looks so much older. And yet this suspension bridge is still in service in Cincinnati today. Of course, we know and we're told that it's been renovated numerous times. But this bridge would be well over 150 years old now. An incredible architectural and engineering achievement. And now we move to Elsinore Arch, or Elsinore Tower. Of course, they're not going to call it Elsinore Castle, even though it very obviously looks like a castle. Built in 1883 as part of Cincinnati's Waterworks program. And we look at this and we wonder why on earth they would ever even try to call this an arch or a tower. When it's very clear, it appears as though it's a castle that is comprised of a couple towers and an arch. But I suppose it depends on your perspective. And again, we're left with that meandering question. Why do you need such a structure for waterworks? Why is it imperative to have a couple towers, an arch, and a wall that really looks like the front of a castle for the waterworks? And of course, the year plate on there looks like it was added much later. What's really the story behind this structure? It's another anomaly in a series of anomalies that stands out. And we're only just getting started with Cincinnati. And now let's take a look at City Hall, the building on the right. Don't worry, we'll get to the cathedral on the left in a second. The City Hall was built in 1893, and of course they give us the usual story of it being Richardsonian revival architecture, whatever that really means. And we have this incredible tower with an amazing clock face on it, because apparently you can't have a city hall without an amazing tower and a clock face on it, especially in 1893. This one bears a striking resemblance to the City Hall in Milwaukee. And we see the same remarkable architecture that apparently you could do with all the traveling workers wandering all over the United States in the 1890s. And when you didn't recognize safety standards, you could apparently work with larger stones much more quickly. It's an incredible structure. But now we look at the tower of St. Peter in Chains Cathedral. This was built in 1845. The cornerstone was laid in 1841. Yes, they tell us that this incredible cathedral was built in 4 years, in Greek Revival style. This is a Roman Catholic church built in Greek Revival style in 4 years, supervised by the bishop himself. 4 years, 1841 to 1845, to build this remarkable and extraordinary edifice. And yes, I'm combining adjectives on it. The tower is 220 feet tall, made of pure white limestone. And it was the tallest building in Cincinnati for many decades. This is the interior. Remember, it only took them 4 years, in 1841 to 1845, to construct this incredible building that still stands today as a beautiful building, of which there is nothing in our modern inventory that remotely compares to it. That's the historical narrative we're given. And it's a building like this that I believe is a total slap in the face. Unless you want to believe that a bishop and the parishioners and the poor that they pulled off the streets could build such a building in 4 years. Oh, of course they could, because they didn't have regulations and they neglected safety standards. And now we go to the Cincinnati Union Terminal, our Art Deco building, as if we haven't seen enough wonders in Cincinnati. This one was constructed in 5 years, from 1928 to 1933. No, it was not disrupted by the Great Depression. The size of this structure and just the appearance of it, it almost gives a futuristic appearance, as though this was something that was seen in the movie Metropolis, even though that was a contemporary movie that was made slightly before this incredible structure was completed. It just has something about it that's very futuristic, and this is another structure that stands today, appearing gargantuan. And we have to wonder, why was such a large structure required? Much like the Union Station we see in so many other cities, we see a height that doesn't really make a lot of sense. At least if the Union Terminal is for the function that it's stated. But we certainly have to wonder about that. And our minds can go to many different places about what other functions such a building like this could be used for. An older photo, and again, the building already has an aged appearance. And we see the similar works of art on the building that we do on other Art Deco buildings. Certainly this reminds us of the same sort of construction we saw in Kansas City, if we remember our Liberty Tower exploration, and the Kansas City Union Station. Yeah, just look at the interior of this terminal. Again, completely unnecessary. And it was completed during the Great Depression. Did we still have the traveling workers going around at that time? Were people so happy that they could easily finish construction? Were monetary resources unlimited during the Great Depression? Everywhere you look inside this building, you see incredibly high ceilings. You see ornate detail. And you see a floor that you have to wonder. Cincinnati Music Hall, completed in 1878. Because why not? You need to have a very ornate and unbelievably large music hall for all of your musical performances. You look at this building and you have to wonder. It almost has an old church appearance to it, including the very large portal window that we see, along with the well-detailed towers and the very large windows. 1878. And this is yet another building that still stands today, looking very similar to what we just saw in the picture. Just incredible that these buildings can endure with this kind of architecture. It shows what can be achieved when they're built this way. I find it hard to believe that such a beautiful and enduring building was constructed by traveling workers who neglected regulation. I find that explanation unacceptable. If you believe that, that's fine, but I do not believe that. Whoever crafted this building, the architects and those that constructed it, they were masters at their craft. And you look at the interior of the building, and again you see such ornate detail. And this is from 1878. This is just something that is beyond the ability of words to describe. And you see the detail in the ceiling and the beautiful chandelier. And yet the symbols that we have that don't make sense. Why do we have these kind of symbols in a building from 1878 in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States? And of course you have the usual appearance in the paintings of something looking like it's from St. Peter's in Rome. Why? And now we move on to the amazing art museum in Cincinnati. And again, we are treated to another wondrous building. This one was established in 1881, supposedly, and yet again we see a very, very large building, and supposedly this is one of the oldest art museums that's west of the Allegheny Mountains. Just the size and the scope of this structure defies easy explanation, and it's almost as though we're looking at some incredible building from a different time. Looking at the old skyline of Cincinnati, we're treated to many old world buildings, and we'll be told that this is the Art Deco architecture, and yet that's the recurring theme with Cincinnati. Regardless of when you look at the picture, the drawing, the city always seems to be so well built out. What's the true origin behind many of these buildings? How was this city achieved? And why does it still stand today with so many examples of the old world? You can accept the historical narrative if you so choose. And you can also accept the fact that we can't build buildings like this today because we opt not to due to regulation and due to the lack of availability of workers and, of course, due to safety standards. However, I find that explanation very thin when you look at the miraculous achievements in the city of Cincinnati. And whatever timeline we go on, even if we take everything at face value, from 3 individuals who established a settlement in 1788 to 1930 and having all of these buildings, many of which were given timelines of 2, 3, most of 5 years, given the size, the scope, and the detail on these buildings. How could this have been possible? And I invite other explanations. What do you think is the real origin of Cincinnati? And yet here we see something else that defies simple explanation. The vertical railway. This is something that we've seen in other locations, such as Duluth, Minnesota, and many other cities that have elevated areas. And isn't that an extraordinary looking building? That's definitely not an architecture type that you see or you would expect to see. It almost looks like something from either a fantasy movie or a science fiction movie. What exactly is the explanation here? And we follow this vertical railway down, and we see how well built out this city is. And we're told that this photo is potentially from the 1880s, but again, who knows? This photo could really be from any time frame. But what we see in it inspires our imaginations. And here we have this dome structure that was part of an area for elephants in the Cincinnati Zoo, supposedly built around 1906. I guess the elephants needed a dome so they would know that they were in a constitutional republic that practices democracy, because the best way you show democracy is through a dome. And here we're looking at what was supposedly a failed subway project for the city of Cincinnati. Yet this doesn't look like this is construction. This looks like this is something that they're digging out. There are many strange and conflicting stories when you try to look into this account. So we'll just look at the picture and try to extrapolate what we can from what we see. Was this really a subway that was under construction, or does it look like this is something that's being dug out? It's hard to say. When you look at the panoramic photos of Cincinnati, you see so many buildings in the bluffs and running in the terrain all the way down to the river. Buildings such as this, where you see those very large foundation stones, the large archways, and the very large towers. This almost reminds me of many of the so-called tors going back to the buildings in Germany. And yet here it is reflected in Cincinnati, in Ohio, in the United States. There are just so many conflicting accounts, and what we see is very hard to reconcile with what we're told. And I think Cincinnati is one of the most obvious examples. Yes, there's many other cities where you can find it. And here again we see another picture of this vertical railway, this vertical tram, and the buildings built up on the bluff. It's all very impressive. All in the 19th century. It would be very interesting to actually see all of this constructed. To have construction photos, to wonder how the foundations were laid out, how every detail behind these larger buildings was completed, to say nothing of this vertical tram or this vertical railway. And it's an all too common story. It's a recurring theme that you see in older cities. And again, another building that resembles a castle. And of course we'll be told that this is the Armory in Cincinnati, because what else would it be? Well, it could be a waterworks building, it could be some sort of church, it could be a city hall, it could be a library. Well, this one, they consider it an armory. Same type of construction, the larger foundation blocks, stellar towers. Why don't they just call it a castle? Oh no, it's an armory. And don't you like that little tower there that's protruding? That had to be very easy to build. And again, they managed to pull it all off in a very short amount of time. There is no shortage of buildings that defy simple explanation in Cincinnati. And this is definitely a city where you see the intersection of so many of these stories. And I have to wonder what it would have been like to have been someone living in Cincinnati around 1900 in the early 20th century. To walk around and see all these incredible pieces of architecture, all this remarkable engineering. Somebody had to ask some questions. Somebody had to be wondering what was going on. This stands out. And we have to wonder, what were people told at the start of the 20th century? They were given the historical narrative and they'd better conform to it, because we know what places were waiting for them if they did not. And here you see it again. So many large buildings, great bridges, all of it all standing as though it's been there much longer than 50 to 100 years that we're told that the city's only been around at the start of the 20th century. Yet everywhere you look, you see ornate architecture. These aren't the warehouse buildings that we'd expect to see off the river. These are beautiful ornate buildings with towers and spires and detail in every single one of them. And looking again at the vertical railway or the vertical tram. And here's another view. And we see a trolley that's operating. And we're even told in the history of Cincinnati that the trolley system was established in the 1850s. And they had large trolley cars that were pulled by horses. How does that make any sense? It goes back to that question, why not just build larger wagons and have the horses pull those? Why the large trolley cars? And you see the very large building on the bluff in the background. You have evidence and recurring evidence of buildings and infrastructure that were already present, of a transportation system that was already present. And then you see these other large buildings. Was this all so easy to do in the 19th century? Or is there an entirely different explanation? And is Cincinnati one of the locations that makes it abundantly obvious? And yet you see a photo like this on the ground, and you see the cobblestone street with the tracks that are running right through it. Again, another common theme. And yet a beautiful ornate building. And again, the sign of scaling with some of the columns, all the detail. And you look at this larger building and you see portal windows and you see other windows with beautiful ornate designs. I guess they couldn't label this one a church, or maybe they would try because there would appear to be crosses on it, yet a different kind of cross. What do you think? What's the story behind this building? And I'm not even going to talk about all the lines that we see going everywhere. And a beautiful water fountain, again from the 19th century, because no city would be complete without a beautiful water fountain. We have to wonder, if this was so easy to achieve, with the explanation that we're given, how did it affect the people that lived in Cincinnati? This is a picture of my great-grandparents who lived in Cincinnati from 1890 to 1910. This is actually from one of the great expositions that occurred. And what's intriguing is, while we can see that the background behind them is clearly some sort of painted picture, why would it show a structure like that? And I have to wonder if my great-grandparents asked those questions that I thought. Or did they simply keep their mouths shut and keep their questions to themselves, out of concern for what would happen to them if they asked questions in the open? It's a very disturbing consideration. And this was their house. And you see that this is a very well-built house. We see ornate detail on a simple residence. And we know that it's very expensive to try to get a house like this today. Yet you see the same stylings within the foundation. This would certainly be a wonderful house to have today. This is certainly something you would know would last. And yet these are not houses that we can acquire today. I mean, perhaps we can, but of course we're told that it's at exorbitant cost and it's beyond our means. And yet I look at this house and I can't help but be inspired. The beauty in it, while it may seem like a simple brick structure, there's something about it that seems almost futuristic or from some sort of fantasy world. But this was from over 100 years ago. We do have construction photos of the Cincinnati Union Terminal, and yet this construction photo seems to have many issues with it. Something about it doesn't seem to match the scale that we saw earlier. And this photo is dated 1931, supposedly within the middle of the 5-year period, and you're never going to see any construction photos of how they built the interior, or certainly not laying the foundation. And here we have a very modest observatory. Because you've got every other amazing building in Cincinnati, you need to have a very beautiful observatory. Again, from the 19th century, and again showing the signs of Greco-Roman architecture, because how else do you build an observatory? You really wonder what the original function of this building was, and what was its original capabilities. Oh, and did I mention that Cincinnati was home to many breweries? Because, the best breweries are castles. As if we haven't seen enough full-size castles in Cincinnati. Well, there's some more castles for you, and a variety of breweries. Just 6 of them. How large were these compounds? What was the function of these compounds, or these series of buildings originally? You see everything here. Large smokestacks. Again, the ornate architecture, the arched doorways. There are just so many aspects about this city that defy simple explanation, and they defy the historical narrative that we're given. Oh, and finally, what city would be complete without a fire? Now, we're told that this fire occurred in 1881 in Cincinnati, and it was a modest fire, although this one photo, this doesn't look like a very modest fire to me. It looks like many of the great buildings were destroyed and there was a lot of damage. And they give us the usual story that this was supposedly from some sort of toy maker that caused the fire. Of course, we wonder about the story, and we have to consider what the real story is behind what the fire was, and what's the real story behind Cincinnati. The more we look into it, the more we look into trying to explain the historical narrative, compared with the pictures that we see. There are so many contradictions, and there are so many questions that come up from this one city, that you could really look at Cincinnati as one of the quintessential examples of how the narrative does not fit with what we see. If you want to accept it, it means you have to accept everything you're told at face value, and you have to discount every single discrepancy that you see. And we've seen many discrepancies in every single building that we've looked at, and we see the discrepancies right now in this supposed fire photo. Yet you can go to Cincinnati to this day and still see many of these remarkable buildings. Well, as always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me.
Take a tour of a place from the comfort of your phone.
Cincinnati. Yet another modern appearing American city. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel.
Notion
Philadelphia is different, though, than the other cities that we've. Philadelphia is different, though, than the other cities that we've looked at on this channel. Going further east in the United States, we see that this city is something from a historical time frame, that it does seem to have the time frame that would make sense for the development of a city. And yet, most of the structures that we're going to be looking at were all built since 1800. So it's an interesting comparison that we're going to be looking at with what we've considered with other cities. Now, considering the fact that Philadelphia was at one time the capital of the United States before it was inexplicably removed to Washington, D.C., and yes, I say removed because that's the feeling that the historical narrative gives you, you have to wonder why the capital did not remain in Philadelphia. This is a beautiful city, and it makes all the sense for the capital of the United States to be in Philadelphia. This is where the Declaration of Independence was signed. Why did they move it? Why did the importance of this city change? And when we look at the structures in the city of Philadelphia that we're going to be looking at in this exploration, we have to wonder, especially when we look at the central structure of this exploration, the Philadelphia City Hall. Let's take a look at the history of the Philadelphia City Hall, and the source for this account is going to come from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Frequent viewers of the channel may have heard that I do have a very close collaborator who is an American civil engineer, a person who operated their own independent business successfully for several decades through a couple of recessions and great difficulties, and was always successful. Additionally, this is a person that's earned my personal trust, and I believe that should be the prime qualifier in if you're going to trust someone's collaboration, not simply their professional certifications. Not that I'm telling you to question professional certifications, that's your own decision. I'm merely sharing with you how I operate when it comes to research for the channel. So I believe that this account from the American Society of Civil Engineers lays it out very effectively what the agreed upon narrative for the Philadelphia City Hall is. Philadelphia City Hall was the world's tallest occupied structure and the nation's largest municipal government building when completed. Its load-bearing masonry construction is unique for a building of this size. Philadelphia City Hall was the largest masonry load-bearing wall building in the world at the time of its completion in 1901, stood as the tallest occupied building in the United States until 1909, and still is the largest city hall in the United States. An incredible feat given all of our modern architectural achievements. Of course, naysayers will tell you that we have so many regulations now and there's so many safety standards in place, we could never construct a building like this now. It's not because we lack the means, it's because there's regulation. Well, there's a great reason. The building covers 14.26 acres, originally contained 634 rooms with over 1 million square feet of space, and with its tower and statue of William Penn, rises a total of 548 feet above the ground. Here's where it gets really interesting. The construction of Philadelphia City Hall began in 1872 and was completed in 1901. So they give about a 30-year time frame, which seems credible, but there's more to it than that. The bill providing for the erection of a new city hall passed both branches of Pennsylvania state legislature in early April 1860, but it took them over a decade to get started. Okay, fine, bureaucratic delays and so forth. That makes sense. And the voters of Philadelphia selected Penn Square as the site of City Hall on October 11, 1870. Sounds very similar to the story or account that were given to many other amazing buildings. The building was designed in the Second Empire mode of French Renaissance Revival architectural style by architect John MacArthur Jr. with the assistance of Thomas U. Walter, John Ord, and W. Bledon Powell. Interesting there because has anybody ever seen a building in the First Empire mode of French Renaissance Revival architectural style? What about Third Empire mode? Or maybe Zero Empire mode? I wouldn't be surprised if there were buildings classified as that. I'm being a little facetious, and yet we come across all these different accounts and naming conventions. How exactly does it make any sense? Another interesting note is that two of the names of these architects, including the lead architect John MacArthur and John Ord, MacArthur and Ord are both very well-known historical names within the United States Army. Intriguing. Yes, my favorite adjective sometimes. The walls are brick, faced with white marble, and rise to a height of 337 feet above the ground. Not including the statue of William Penn, the tower rose 173 feet above the top of the building's masonry construction. The building measures 486 feet by 470 feet and rises 7 stories high. Well, of course, you need to have a 7-story building for your city hall. Can't do it with 2, 3, or 4, could you? The 18-foot, 3-inch high basement story was constructed of white granite blocks that weigh from 2 to 5 tons and form walls up to 22 feet thick. There's no adjective that can really describe how unbelievable this is. The foundations of the tower rest on a bed of concrete 100 feet square and 8 feet 6 inches thick. The Tacony Iron and Metal Company hired civil engineer C.R. Carl Robert Grimm to design the upper wrought iron frame, metal-clad portion of the tower, which surmounted the masonry tower and supported the 37-foot tall, 27-ton bronze statue of William Penn, which they lifted to the top of it, obviously, or so we're told. The tower was designed to carry its dead load along with live loads on 3 floors and the balcony of 100 pounds-feet and horizontal wind loads of 50 pounds per feet squared. The octagonal prism tower designed by C.R. Grimm consisted of wrought iron framework that supported the cast iron outer plates, which were electroplated with copper and then covered with a fresh coat of aluminum. The tower's pins and anchor bolts were steel. So that's the official engineering account of the Philadelphia City Hall. And what do you think of it so far? We're just not even going to say anything about this construction photo or the veracity of it, but I like how these statues are just hanging out there on their own as though there's nothing to support them. This construction photo doesn't even rate a construction photo. I'm not even sure what to make of this photo. Why don't you let me know in the comments? You like the phantom tower that we have there in the background? And what's with that pole there? What exactly is that for? And who knows, this photo does not even give the feeling of being real despite being from the city of Philadelphia's Department of Records. So I don't even know what to make of it. However, it's an interesting enigma that I thought I would share. And other construction photos. Isn't it intriguing how we never have construction photos of the foundation or construction of the interior of the building? And one of my benchmark buildings, and I think it's important that we have a benchmark building, for me and for this channel, it's the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines, Iowa, because it's an unprecedented building that doesn't make sense. And here we see similar construction of the Philadelphia City Hall in Philadelphia with the scaffolding. Of course, you'll never see a single column or pillar being put into place. You'll see what appears to be cranes and scaffolding and a curious lack of individuals on the work site. And we have our usual plethora of excuses for why that's not in the photo, despite the fact that years before this building was made, we had very wonderful photos of the Grand Army pass and review in Washington, D.C. at the end of the United States Civil War. As always, make your own judgments. However, looking at this scaffolding, do you really get the impression that they're building a building? Or does it look more like they're renovating it? And who knows what's the situation with the sky in the background, or how it seems as though we have connections that just disappear. Now, a photograph of the tower. And again, a photograph that raises more questions than it answers. And this is one of my issues when we're looking at photographs. And of course you're going to say, Aurelian, well, why do we use photographs? Because whether the photographs are fully genuine or altered, they still give the impression of a narrative that we're supposed to believe. You look at how precise the construction of the top of this tower is, and this matches many of the supposed construction photos that we have of many other capitals. And what's most interesting to me about the Philadelphia City Hall is that I think this building compares, if not exceeds, the greatest state capitals in the United States. But for me, the real story is when you look at the interior of the building. You can see that the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines is a stupendous building that's on top of a hill and directs all attention towards it. You can see the same thing with the Philadelphia City Hall. Found this little sketch interesting because this reminded me of the LeQueux sketches, a two-dimensional sketch from the side of the building. Because apparently that's all you need to design a building, just like that's all you need for a patent. You don't need any detailed information. Just do a little side diagram that's two-dimensional, because we don't live in a three-dimensional world, do we? No, Carl Sagan is not going to appear in this episode, okay? Right now, the Voyager probe is out of communication distance, so unfortunately, he's not appearing.
I've been in and out of therapy with BetterHelp for a few years now, and it's made prioritizing my mental and emotional health so much easier. Your 20s are such a confusing time in your life. You're old enough to make your own decisions, but too inexperienced to know what's best. When I think of my friends, some have moved away, started their career, some are still in school, and
Then you see the ornate detail in all the statues, the carvings, or the prefabricated construction. Or really, how did they do this? How much time did it take to either fabricate or carve this, however you believe this was constructed, to say nothing of how it was lifted in place? And this has all been standing up there for well over 100 years. And when were these details actually constructed? 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. We have a wide time frame, although what I didn't mention is that according to historical accounts, the building was already occupied in 1877, only a few short years after they began construction. And here you see another detail of what looks to be an eagle with a couple horses around it. I suppose we could say those are American symbols and represent the time frame that this supposedly occurred in its construction in the 19th century. And we see the usual surrounding columns that look like it's something out of Rome. Always the same story with these buildings. How exactly are these columns French Second Empire Renaissance? I have no idea, and I'm not going to try to speculate here. I do like this symbol, though. There's something very profound about it, and it conveys something that you tend not to see when you walk in the National Mall of Washington, D.C. I wonder if they were looking at this building as a potential Capitol building for the United States. Why do we have this contradiction in the story of Philadelphia being the capital, and then they decided to move it to Washington, D.C., a city that they constructed from nothing, supposedly because it was supposed to be the most centralized location in the United States at that time? Well, the United States grew very quickly, and with our ability, if we go off the historical narrative, to quickly pull cities out of nothing and establish these incredible buildings, why didn't we build a new capital further to the west that was more centrally located? Why didn't they make, say, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Chicago, or finally Omaha the capital of the United States? There's always a slew of explanations for why they did and didn't. Very telling photo as to just how tall the statue of William Penn is. And we recall its weight and height designations, and here you can really see its scale. And they supposedly lifted it to the top of the building, and we see a photo where it's not on the top of the building. I would love to see some photos of them actually lifting the statue to the top of the building. And while I wasn't able to find them in my initial explorations, granted I'm working on multiple projects, if anybody does have any photos of that, I would certainly love to see it, and please share them on the channel's official email, or on the comments, or on Reddit. See, this is all you really need, just a series of sketches, and this shows you how it all went down. I'm convinced. This is evidence enough for me. Just show me some sketches, and I believe it. They built the tower, they got the statue on top of it, because the sketches show it. Now, I'm being very facetious with this one. But why is it imperative to show sketches like this? Was this some sort of plan, or was it supposed to be some sort of documentation? Well, if it's documentation, then show us pictures. Like this picture where we look at the interior of this building. And it's here where I think we tell the real story, looking at the interior of these buildings. Because this defies simple explanation. The columns, the pillars, the arches, the ornate detail, the height of the ceilings, and last but not least, the floor. And you will never see a single construction photo, whether it's Philadelphia City Hall, the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines, the State Capitol in Connecticut, or name a building. For some reason, they never decided to document any of this internal construction, the construction of the floor, the foundation. Well, tell us about it and give us some supposed details. Yet nobody wanted to take any photos of it. I think it would be a stupendous illustration of the abilities and the capabilities of the people of the 19th century, as we're told in our historical narrative, if they had some photos showing the erection of these incredible internal structures. Now think about it. Do you think a building like this could be built now? If we took all the resources, and let's just say we removed all these supposed regulatory requirements and all these safety requirements that allegedly prevent construction of a building like this now, do you really think we have the capability to construct something like this now? In 30 years? Or in 6 years, because that's all the time they said it took for them to start building the building and then occupying it, and the rest of the time was on the tower? That's where the narrative gets even more dicey, in my humble opinion. And just in this photo alone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 that we can see in the immediate photo of columns. Look at this. This is really a room in and of itself that defies explanation. It's almost like we're looking at King Arthur's round table here. And who knows? For all we know, we could be looking at some remnant of that time frame. Yes, it's probably going to far-fetched aspects, but who's to say it wasn't inspired? Because we have all these descriptions from our myth and our legends that we're told are myth or legends, and yet you can still walk in this building today. You can still see all of this today. This is not a building from a World's Fair that no longer exists, that we have questions about it. This is a building you can go to today, and you can verify for yourself, without photos, that all of this is real. All of this exists, and all of this stands today. And yes, supposedly, this building has a very colorful history, that our mainstream is telling us that there's lots of allegations of corruption, and that this building is an eyesore, and that numerous times they wanted to tear it down. And that even to this day, there are some people who want to tear it down. Isn't it always the same story with old world buildings, whether they're old manors, or city halls, or state capitals? Why would anybody want to tear this down? And there's even reports that to try to tear something like this down would bankrupt the city. Could anybody tear this down now? Look at these columns. Look at how large this is. So we always question, is it easier to destroy or create? This is something that defies explanation. And this is really an otherworldly building, and it's why I'm not going to use my usual adjectives to describe it. This is a building that is beyond everything that we've looked at. And this is something that in my mind is above the benchmark set by the Iowa State Capitol, looking at the interior. The detail and the effort in this amount of material. It's all still standing today. Of course they want to tear this down. It's right here in plain sight. And if you want to be one of those naysayers who say, well, this just looks like any other municipal building, that's very boring. Well, you really got to have some, let's just say, deep conditioning on your mind to not just be completely blown away when you see all of this. This is something out of a high fantasy movie, a science fiction movie. I mean, I'm reminded of many scenes from different great fantasy movies where they showed the interior of incredible palaces. I don't even know how you'd classify this building. I attempted to classify the Iowa State Capitol as a palace. Is this a palace? Or is this some sort of otherworldly building that shouldn't even have any kind of classification on it? Looking at the interior, I still try to visualize how they would have established this. Oh, and they also had a bathroom. And I know that's a bit of a joke about the bathroom with some of these older buildings, but they also had a nice bathroom. Although it looks like it's a little older, it does have some ornate detail to it. So just a little bit of a comical note to finish our discussion on the Philadelphia City Hall. Where would we be without some strange photos of construction going on in the street as though there's something underground? And you see what appears to be the railroad tracks, and we also see the surrounding buildings. You have to wonder what exactly is going on in here. Are they trying to show us something that there's something underground? Are they renovating the street and doing it with some unique aspects that we don't fully understand? Well, it just wouldn't be an old 19th century photograph unless you had something strange like this going on. Again, we had unlimited means at that time. And it's interesting, I've gotten some feedback where some people have tried to tell me that it's disrespectful to suggest that these buildings and these achievements were not done by these people at this time. Well, somebody clearly built them, but I also think it's even more disrespectful to not ask questions and not to seek the exploration for how it was done. This is a 30th Street station, an internal transit station in our patented Art Deco building, built in 6 years from 1927 to 1933 and supposedly rebuilt in 1989. And as any typical Art Deco building, we see the very large ceiling, and of course it must have very large columns. Otherwise it's not a true Art Deco building. Again, we have to ask the questions on this. How is this done, and why is this not done now? Weren't there more construction standards in place in the 1930s? And what about the Great Depression? All these incredible buildings always built the Great Depression. Here we have another example of what's supposedly Art Deco from that same location. And you'll see that it looks like every other Art Deco building that was built in that same time frame, except for the one in Kansas City, which was built before the Art Deco period, but still looks Art Deco. So I don't know what to tell you on that one. Is it disrespectful to not consider and compare historical accounts? What is being depicted here? And why does this not match what exactly was going on in the United States at that time? Now we go to the Fisher Fine Arts Library, a beautiful library built in 1890, probably within a year. And here we see the same details of very large and elaborate blocks and bricks and very solid construction. Again, I have to ask the question, is this something that we could do today with all of our modern means? Of course, we'll see examples of our modern means trying to renovate these buildings, or supposedly renovate these buildings. But when you look at a building like this and you see this kind of detail for what's supposedly just a fine arts building, this certainly goes well beyond the concepts of modesty. I'm reminded of other buildings that were supposedly built in this 1890 time frame. And here again, we have this unique architectural styling where we have this larger rotunda, and then it builds up into smaller series of floors above it. Why don't we build like this anymore? It's very beautiful and it's very alluring. I even like the windows right down there. Then you look at the doorway and the entrance, all these bricks and larger blocks and archways. It would be very interesting to see construction photos of just these archways alone, to say nothing of the floor and all the other detail that went into this. I even like the window. Once again, we see what appears to be inspired and imaginative design that vastly exceeds what we have available today. And the interior, almost giving stylings of something from a time far more glorious. It was just done in the 1890s, and to suggest otherwise is being insulting to the people who did it, and the architect who made it happen. I still wonder how everyone just happened to be wandering the country and they were also skilled in this extreme variety of architectural types that were given from 1860 to 1910. But don't ask questions, just accept it.
This could be the most kissable kiss yet. Hershey's Milk-licious Kisses.
To the Central Library, 1927, another supposed Art Deco building. And I include this just to compare and contrast it with what you just saw with the Fisher Fine Arts Library, supposedly built several decades before this one. Yet both of these buildings convey an opulence and some sort of methods that seem beyond our capabilities. You see it in the size, the height of the ceilings, the pillars and the columns. And on to the Philadelphia Stock Exchange, thrown up in 2 years from 1832 to 1834. Once again, I have to ask the question, and I've never really seen buildings like this. Could we build a building like this today? We're told it was built in 2 years from 1832 to 1834. Once again, with the columns, the pillars, the large windows, and the very large blocks with details within them. I even like the detail around the rotunda, both the inscription and then the pieces that seem to be added. 1832 to 1834, before the widespread use of photography. Even has a nice little tower on it, and you see more columns on the tower, and what's supposedly a wind direction finder on a weather vane. Yes, of course. What an incredible building to operate as a stock exchange or a mercantile exchange, as they tell us. And soon, this building will be 200 years old. This is the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, originally constructed in 1904. Supposedly it was renovated and reopened in the 1980s, and it's now facilitated by the Hyatt, and it's called the Hyatt at the Bellevue. And you can go stay there still today. And as you can see in these amazing, beautiful details in this building, we have the usual trappings of very large columns, very wonderfully constructed floors, and high ceilings. Now tell me, do you really think that any of the modern Holiday Inns or the Holiday Inn Expresses actually compare to this? And of course I know people will be saying, well, because we build in brutalist architecture and it's cheaper and we need to have cheap hotel accommodations. Yes, let's discuss what's happened with hotels over the last 3 years. That's probably a topic for another video. Again, another beautiful, amazing, ornate building, and a place I think you would be delighted to stay in as a hotel that truly provides you luxury, something that hotels seem to have gotten away from, especially in the last 3 years. I wonder why that is. I just find these interiors to be one of the most telling aspects of all these buildings that we look at, and there's a reason why I focus on the interiors. This may not be the best picture, but when you look at the sheer beauty and opulence, you see a time long past. Now, people will argue that there's different reasons and causes for why this time long past seems far more luxurious. Now let's take a look at our patented castle for this exploration, Eastern State Penitentiary, designed, it doesn't say constructed, in 1829. I wonder if this penitentiary was designed in the 18th century or the 1700s, if it would be a gigantic star fort. However, we see the typical castle that is always ending up as either an armory, a prison, or, maybe it could be a library. Here's a sketch that shows the original design. Very interesting sketch that shows nothing else around it, and yet there's a very nice, well-developed road that runs right in front of it. Well, apparently this was based on the concept of what they considered individual confinement, but today we call it solitary confinement for rehabilitation. Starts that long, grand tradition of the prison system in the United States. It does have a castle appearance to it, and yet almost a barracks appearance to it. So if this was a building from a different civilization, what was its original function? We have to wonder. And yet just a random photo from Philadelphia showing us a street view. And the time frame on this is confusing. It says somewhere circa 1870s, 1880s. Who really knows on this particular photo? But I find that little clock tower up there to be an interesting aspect to it. And then here's something else that seems to stick out a little bit. Delaware Avenue Market House. And you see this interesting archway that seems very out of place. And again, we have the power lines, and we're looking at some conflicting accounts. Always tend to leave people to adhere to authority because authority has to provide them the answers. Conflicting accounts. For some reason, they don't want to search for answers on themselves. That's not all people, but it seems to be a lot of people. Here's the upper quad from the University of Pennsylvania. This was constructed in 1906, interestingly enough. And I have to wonder, what is it about something like this that compares with what we see in more modern university housing we've looked at on this channel? Going further,
people don't believe it.
Crazy, thinking about the way I once did. The heartbreak changed me, baby. But look at where I ended up. I'm all good already, so moved on. It's scary. I'm not where you left me at all. So if you don't wanna see me don't wanna see me dancing with somebody. Don't show up, don't come out, don't stop caring about me now. Walk away, you know how. Don't stop caring about me now.
Yeah, I can never leave this minute.
your love. Forget about the world for a while. You had me at hello. I'm drowning in the blue of your eyes. Even if the love was hurting, I'll be yours. I'll be yours again. I can feel that fire's burning. Give me more. Tell me, would you feel my love? Like you ever been. Tell me, would you feel my love? Yeah, I could never leave this me. Let me feel your love. Tell me, would you feel my love?
I want you to breathe me. Let me be your air. Let me roam your body free. No inhibition, no fear. How deep is your love? Is it like the ocean? What devotion are you? How deep is your love? Is it like Nirvana? Hit me harder again. How deep is your How deep is your love? How deep is your love?
surely deserve me, but I think you do. So I cry and I pray and I beg for you. I fear there's no one to turn to. This all and nothing way of loving, go be sleeping without you. I need somebody to know, somebody to hear, somebody to have, just to know how it feels. It's easy to say, but it's never the same.